So, we need to consider that consciousness, human consciousness in particular, is not an initial datum, but one that needs to be regarded as something that emerged in time. Time being understood simply as the measure of the motions of the interacting bodies in space that enables us to say, for example, that some 14 billion years ago, there was an initial explosion, out of which came the whole of the universe as we know it, though initially bereft of life, indeed, of stars and of planets of which life could exist.
Surely you're not just going to give me that evolution stuff. No. And what has that got to do with signs being something that objects presuppose? A proposition that doesn't exactly leap out at you as true or even as particularly sensible.
Actually, it's not evolution, but something more basic that I have in mind. I want to suggest that semiosis is more basic than evolution, and perhaps explains better what has heretofore been termed evolution. But I admit, that is a bit much to ask at this point. Perhaps indeed I cast my net too wide. Let me trim my sails a bit, I said, switching metaphors, and ask you to agree only to this much, that there is a difference in principle between something that exists in our awareness and something that exists whether or not we are aware of it.
And what are you getting at?
A distinction between objects and things, wherein by object I mean something existing as known, something existing in my awareness, and by thing, rather something that exists whether or not I have any awareness of it.
But surely you do not deny that one and the same thing may be one time unknown and another time known. I mean, this is merely an accident of time, an occurrence of chance, hardly a distinction from principle.
But surely you do not deny that an object of experience as such necessarily involves a relation to me in experiencing it, whereas a thing in the environment of which I have no awareness lacks such a relation.
Well, anyone can see that.
And surely you concede that an object of experience need not be a thing in the same sense that it is an object.
What do you mean in saying that?
Consider the witches of Salem.
There were no witches in Salem.
What did we hang?
Innocent women.
Innocent of what?
Of being witches.
But the people at Salem who hanged these women thought they were hanging witches.
Well, they were wrong.
So you say. But surely you see that if the executioners were wrong, something that did exist was hanged because of something that did not exist. I mean, surely you see that something public, something objective in my sense, the being of a witch, was confused with something that did exist, the being of a female human organism. And that something existing was hanged precisely because it was objectively identified with something that did not exist.
Well, I think I'm beginning to see what you're getting at, but what does this have to do with signs?
Every mistake involves taking something that is not for something that is.
Well, true enough.
So every mistake involves an action of signs.
Well, yes, I see that to see a witch, you have to be mistaken. But to see a woman, you only need eyes, not signs. It's the truth that I'm interested in. By your account, all that signs account for is the possibility of being mistaken. What about the possibility of being right? Are you a realist or aren't you?
If you grant me that an object necessarily, whereas a thing only contingently, involves a relation to me as cognizant, then in order to advance my argument that every object presupposes sign, I need to ask you to consider the further distinction between sensation and perception, where by the former I understand the stimulation of my nervous system by the physical surroundings, and by the latter I understand the interpretation of those stimuli according to which they present to me something to be sought, something to be avoided, something about which I am indifferent.
I see no problem with that.
Then perhaps you will grant further that whereas sensation, so construed, always and necessarily involves me in physical relations that are also objective in their termini, perception, by contrast, insofar as it assimilates sensation to itself, necessarily involves physical relations that are also objective, but further involve me in objective relations that may or may not be physical, especially insofar as I may be mistaken about what I perceive. In other words, sensations give me the raw material out of which perception constructs what are for me objects of experience. such that these objects have their being precisely as a network of relations, only some of which are relations independently of the workings of my mind, and which relations are which is not something self-evident, but something that needs to be sorted out over the course of experience insofar as experience becomes human experience.
Why do you say insofar as it becomes human experience?
Because the notion of a difference between objects and things never occurs to any other animal except those of our own species.
Huh?
Well, you're a realist, aren't you?
Well, of course.
What do you mean by that?
Simple. That the objects we experience have a being independent of our experience of them.
But you just admitted that we experience objects which are not things.
Yeah, when we make mistakes.
But not only when we make mistakes.
How do you figure?
Is there a boundary between Texas and Oklahoma?
Is the Pope Catholic?
I take that to be a yes.
Well, of course, there's a boundary between Texas and Oklahoma.
But look at
I'm no Okie.
But look at the satellite photographs. No such boundary shows up there. I mean, would you say that the boundary exists objectively rather than physically, but nonetheless really?
Now, that's a funny way of talking.
Not as funny as thinking that social or cultural realities, whether involving error or not, exist inside your head as merely psychological states. Consider that what sensations you have depends not only on your physical surroundings, but just as much upon your bodily type. Consider further how you organize your sensations depends even more upon your biological heredity than it does upon the physical surroundings. I mean, if you see that, then you should be able to realize that the world of experience, not the physical environment as such, is what is properly called the objective world. You cannot avoid further realizing that the objective world of every species is species-specific.
Species-specific objective worlds? I thought the objective world was the world that is the same for everybody and everything, the world of what really is.
On the contrary, the world that is the same regardless of your species is merely the physical environment. And it is, moreover, a species-specifically human hypothesis rather than anything directly perceived. Because sensation directly and necessarily puts us in contact with the surroundings and precisely something of their physical aspect of things obtaining independently of us. We can, from within experience, conduct experiments which enable us to distinguish within our experience between aspects of the world which exist physically as well as objectively, and aspects which exist only objectively. That, my friend, is why realism is a philosophical problem, not a self-evident truth. I mean, after all, reality is a word and needs to be learned like any other. You need to read something of Peirce.
You seem to be veering into idealism. Could you state clearly your meaning of subjectivity here?
Let us consider the howl of a wolf just as a physical event in the environment, a sound or set of vibrations on a certain wavelength propagating over a finite distance from its source within the physical surroundings.
I see no difficulty in that.
Now, let us suppose two organisms endowed with appropriate organs of what we call hearing, situated within the range of the propagation of that sound. What would you suppose?
I would suppose that they would hear the sound if they're not asleep or too distracted.
Let us suppose they hear the sound, the one organism being a sheep, the other another wolf. Now, the sound occurring physically and subjectively in the environment, independently of our organism's hearing of it, enters into a relation with each of the two organisms. The sound not only exists physically, it now exists also objectively, for it is heard. It is something of which the organisms are respectively aware. It is a kind of object. But what kind? For the sheep, the howl of the wolf is an object of repulsion, something inspiring fear and an urge to hide or flee. For the other wolf, a male wolf, as it happens, heeding the advice of St. Thomas to use sexual examples to make something memorable, let us say that the howl reveals a female in heat. Now, such a sound, no different in its physical subjectivity from the vibrations reaching the frightened sheep, inspires in the male attraction, as it were, what former